The dog was not waiting for freedom. He was waiting for someone who never came back. Rain hammered the metal roof of the military kennel long after sunset. The sound echoed through the empty corridors like distant drums, steady and cold. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting pale reflections across concrete floors damp from the storm outside. At the far end of the facility stood a separate enclosure surrounded by warning signs. The signs were impossible to miss. Do not enter alone. Authorized personnel only. High-risk K9. Yet the dog behind the steel gate barely moved. Ranger sat silently in the corner of the kennel, his black and tan coat dim beneath the harsh white light. He looked nothing like the stories written inside his file. The reports described a K9 that rejected every handler. A dog nobody could manage. A dog many believed was beyond saving. But none of those words explained the look in his eyes. Ranger stared toward the entrance of the building. Not at the people who passed by. Not at the sounds around him. Toward the door itself. As though he expected someone to walk through it at any moment. As though he had been waiting a very long time. Sergeant Miles Harper stopped beside the enclosure and folded his arms. He had worked around military dogs for nearly 20 years. He had seen fear. He had seen stubbornness. He had seen confusion. What he saw in Ranger was something different. "Tomorrow is the review board," he muttered quietly. "Last chance, buddy." Ranger did not react. The dog remained fixed on the distant doorway. Miles sighed and continued down the corridor. A few minutes later, another vehicle pulled into the parking lot outside. Headlights swept across the rain-soaked windows before disappearing. The main entrance opened. Cold wind followed a tall man into the building. Ethan Walker removed his rain jacket and shook water from the sleeves. At 37 years old, the former Navy SEAL medic carried himself with the calm posture of someone who had spent years in difficult places. His hair was shorter than military regulations required now, but old habits remained. He nodded politely to the night staff and signed a visitor log. "You picked a rough night to visit," one employee said. Ethan smiled faintly. "Sometimes the best stories start in bad weather." The employee laughed. "Then you came to the right place." Ethan had heard about Ranger weeks earlier. The stories traveled fast through military circles. A former operational K9. Multiple failed placements. Endless evaluations. Every attempt ending the same way. Most people talked about the dog like a problem waiting to happen. Ethan had learned long ago that labels often hid the truth. "Where is he?" he asked. The employee pointed down the corridor. "Last kennel on the left." Ethan thanked him and started walking. The further he moved through the building, the quieter everything became. Only the rain remained. Rain on the roof. Rain against the windows. Rain tapping gently through the darkness beyond the walls. Eventually, he reached the final enclosure. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Ranger looked larger than photographs suggested. Strong shoulders. Intelligent eyes. A body built through years of training and discipline. Yet it was not the dog's size that caught Ethan's attention. It was the stillness. Ranger did not bark. Did not pace. Did not growl. He just watched the distant entrance. Waiting. Ethan moved closer to the gate. The dog slowly turned his head. Their eyes met. Most animals looked away after a moment. Ranger did not. The German shepherd studied him carefully. Ethan studied him right back. Somewhere in the silence between them, something felt wrong. Not dangerous. Wrong. Like a puzzle with a missing piece. "So you are Ranger," Ethan said softly. The dog remained motionless. Ethan crouched several feet from the gate. He did not reach toward the dog. Did not call him closer. Did not issue commands. The rain continued falling outside. 1 minute passed. Then another. Ranger eventually looked away. Not dismissively. Simply returning his attention to the entrance again. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. The empty doorway sat beneath a flickering light. Nothing moved there. Nobody appeared. Yet Ranger kept watching. Waiting. Hoping. Ethan felt a strange weight settle in his chest. He had treated wounded soldiers. Comforted grieving families. Sat beside people carrying invisible scars. He recognized that expression. Not anger. Not aggression. Loss. Deep loss. The kind that lingered long after everyone else moved on. Ethan stood slowly. Behind him, thunder rolled across the distant sky. Tomorrow the review board would decide Ranger's future. Most people believed they already knew the outcome. As Ethan looked back toward the lonely German shepherd sitting beneath the fluorescent light, he found himself thinking something entirely different. The dog was not broken. The dog was searching. And somewhere buried beneath years of silence, there had to be a reason why. The next morning arrived beneath low gray clouds and the lingering scent of rain. Water still dripped from the edges of the kennel roofs as workers moved through the facility preparing for another day. Ranger sat exactly where Ethan Walker had left him the night before. The same corner, the same posture, the same unwavering focus on the entrance at the end of the corridor. It was as if time had paused for him while the rest of the world continued moving forward. Ethan arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying a paper cup of coffee and a folder he had checked out from the administrative office. Several handlers glanced toward him as he passed. Most already knew why he was there. The story of Ranger had become almost legendary within military K-9 circles. Every new handler believed they would be different. Every new handler eventually walked away disappointed. "You are wasting your time," one trainer said while securing equipment onto a storage rack. "Maybe," Ethan replied calmly, "but I would rather waste time than miss something important." The trainer shook his head and continued working. Ethan entered the observation room overlooking Ranger's enclosure. Large windows provided a clear view of the kennel below. The folder rested heavily in his hands. He opened it and began reading. Evaluation reports, behavioral summaries, transfer recommendations, incident reviews. Page after page told the same story. Ranger resisted commands. Ranger rejected handlers. Ranger failed reassignment attempts. Yet the deeper Ethan read, the more something bothered him. The reports described behavior. They did not explain motive. They listed outcomes. They ignored causes. He flipped through another section. A photograph slid partially free from the folder. Ethan pulled it out. The image showed Ranger several years younger, standing beside a Navy SEAL team. Proud, focused, alert. One figure beside him had been blacked out with administrative markings. Ethan studied the picture carefully. Why remove a face from an old training photograph? Before he could think further, movement below caught his attention. Ranger had shifted position. The German Shepherd was now staring directly toward the observation window. Not aggressively, not anxiously, simply watching. Ethan closed the folder and headed downstairs. Minutes later, he stood outside the enclosure again. This time he brought no leash, no treats, no training tools, just a folding chair. Several staff members slowed their pace to watch. Ethan carried the chair to a spot several feet from the gate and sat down. Nothing more. Ranger observed him quietly. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Ethan never spoke, never moved closer, never attempted control. The facility around them remained busy. Doors opened and closed. Radios crackled. Boots echoed along concrete floors. Yet a strange calm settled over the space between man and dog. Ranger eventually lowered himself onto the floor. Not in submission, not in trust. Simply because he no longer viewed Ethan as an immediate concern. For the first time, Ethan noticed something else. Every few minutes, Ranger glanced back toward the entrance. Always the entrance. Always checking. Waiting. The realization deepened the uneasy feeling in Ethan's chest. This was not the behavior of an animal focused on escape. It was the behavior of someone expecting an arrival. Around noon, Sergeant Miles joined him near the kennel. "Anything yet?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Depends what you mean by anything." Miles folded his arms. "Most people would have tried commands by now." Ethan looked toward Ranger. "I am not interested in commanding him." "Then what are you interested in?" Ethan remained silent for a moment, understanding him. Miles followed his gaze toward the dog. Ranger sat motionless beneath the fluorescent lights. "Good luck," he muttered. Hours later, the facility began quieting for the evening. Staff members headed home. Equipment rooms closed. The sounds of daily activity faded. Ethan remained seated near the enclosure. Ranger remained inside. Neither seemed interested in leaving. As darkness gathered beyond the windows, Ethan noticed something unusual. A delivery truck pulled into the parking lot outside. Headlights briefly swept across the corridor entrance. The moment the light appeared, Ranger jumped to his feet. Not with fear, with hope. Raw, immediate hope. His ears lifted. His eyes widened. Every muscle focused on the doorway. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. The truck driver unloaded supplies and left minutes later. No one entered the building. Slowly, the hope faded from Ranger's expression. He returned to his corner. The movement lasted only seconds. Yet it changed everything. Ethan finally understood one thing with certainty. Ranger was not waiting for freedom. Ranger was waiting for a specific person, and somewhere buried inside years of forgotten files and missing records was the reason why that person never came back. If you are enjoying this story so far, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next chapter of this extraordinary journey. Outside, evening rain began falling once more, and inside the lonely kennel, a German shepherd kept watch over a doorway that refused to open. By the third day, Ethan Walker had become part of Ranger's routine. The former Navy SEAL medic arrived shortly after dawn, carried the same folding chair to the same spot beside the enclosure, and sat without expectation. The staff noticed it. Some found it strange. Others found it pointless. Ranger seemed to notice it most of all. Outside, cold wind pushed dark clouds across the sky. Inside the kennel facility, fluorescent lights hummed overhead while the scent of disinfectant drifted through the corridors. Ethan opened a fresh notebook and began writing observations. Not reports, not evaluations. Simple details. Ranger checked the entrance every 4 minutes. Ranger ignored passing handlers. Ranger responded to delivery trucks. Ranger watched shadows crossing the doorway. The list grew longer with every hour. None of it resembled aggression. None of it explained the stories filling his official file. Shortly before noon, Ethan requested access to archived records. The administrative office occupied a quiet corner of the facility where old documents gathered dust inside metal cabinets. A civilian employee named Carol greeted him from behind a desk stacked with folders. "Still working on the mystery dog?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "Trying to." Carol laughed softly. "You are stubborn. Occupational hazard." She disappeared into a records room and returned carrying a box. The cardboard looked old enough to belong in a museum. Ethan thanked her and carried it to a nearby table. Most files contained routine paperwork, vaccination records, transfer orders, training certifications. Then he found something unusual. Several pages had been removed. Not misplaced. Removed. The numbering sequence jumped ahead. Entire sections were missing. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Missing records were rarely accidental in military systems. His attention shifted to a faded photograph clipped inside one folder. Ranger appeared again, younger and stronger, standing beside a Navy SEAL wearing desert camouflage. The man's face was partially obscured by a shadow. Yet something caught Ethan's eye immediately. Around the soldier's neck hung a dog tag attached to a braided black cord. Ethan stared at the image. The dog stood pressed close beside the man. Not in a formal pose. Not during training. This was familiarity. Trust built over years. Family. He flipped the photograph over. A handwritten note appeared on the back. Most of the ink had faded. Only 3 words remained readable. Operation Silent Harbor. Ethan frowned. He recognized the name. Not clearly. Just enough to stir an old memory. Somewhere in his years of service, he had heard those words before. He slipped the photograph into his notebook and returned to the kennel. Ranger sat near the gate when Ethan arrived. For the first time, the German shepherd did not immediately look toward the entrance. Instead, he looked directly at Ethan. The moment lasted only seconds. Yet it felt significant. Ethan sat in his usual chair. The silence settled comfortably around them. "I found a clue today," Ethan said quietly. Ranger blinked once. Ethan smiled faintly. "Not much of a conversation partner, are you?" The dog tilted his head slightly. It was the first curious gesture Ethan had seen from him. Across the corridor, 2 handlers paused to watch. "Did you see that?" one whispered. The other nodded. Neither spoke again. The afternoon passed slowly. Clouds thickened outside. Rain began falling against the windows. Around 5 o'clock, a maintenance worker wheeled a cart through the building. Attached to the cart was an old portable speaker playing static-filled radio chatter from a training recording. The sound barely registered with most people. Ranger reacted instantly. Ethan sat upright. The German shepherd froze. Every muscle became rigid. His ears lifted sharply. His eyes widened. For a brief moment, something flashed across the dog's face. Recognition. Then it vanished. Ranger moved toward the rear of the enclosure and sat down again. Ethan's heart began beating faster. That reaction had not been random. It had been connected to the sound, to memory, to something buried far deeper than obedience training. The maintenance worker disappeared down the hallway. The static faded. Ranger slowly returned his attention to the entrance. Ethan remained motionless. Another clue. Another missing piece. That evening, After most staff members left, Sergeant Miles approached carrying a cup of coffee. "You look like you found something." Ethan kept watching Ranger. "Maybe. You always say maybe." Ethan accepted the coffee and smiled. "Because I am not certain yet." Miles glanced toward the enclosure. "What do you think happened to him?" Ethan was silent for several moments. Rain tapped softly against the roof above them. Ranger remained fixed on the doorway, waiting, watching, hoping. Finally, Ethan answered, "I think someone disappeared from his life without explanation." Miles frowned. "That happens to military dogs all the time." "Not like this." Ethan looked down at the faded photograph in his notebook. The shadowed face, the missing records, the forgotten operation, the strange reaction to the radio recording. One story connected all of it. He just could not see the whole picture yet. As darkness settled beyond the windows and the facility lights reflected across the wet pavement outside, Ethan felt closer than ever to the truth. Somewhere hidden behind missing pages and erased names was a person Ranger had never stopped waiting for. And for the first time, Ethan suspected that finding that name might be the key to saving them both. The following morning brought dense fog that wrapped itself around the facility like a blanket. The world beyond the kennel windows seemed distant and blurred, as though the entire base had been separated from the rest of reality. Ethan Walker arrived before sunrise carrying the photograph and notebook he had studied half the night. Sleep had been brief. Questions had not allowed much rest. Ranger was already awake. The German Shepherd sat in his usual place, facing the entrance. The same watchful posture. The same patient vigilance. Yet when Ethan approached the enclosure, something subtle changed. Ranger looked toward him first. Only for a moment. But it happened. Ethan noticed immediately. Trust was not built through dramatic breakthroughs. It revealed itself in moments so small most people overlooked them. Ethan placed his chair beside the gate and sat down. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door opened and closed. Metal carts rolled across concrete floors. The facility slowly came alive. Ranger remained still. Ethan pulled the old photograph from his notebook. "You know him, do not you?" he said quietly. The dog watched him. Ethan studied the partially obscured figure standing beside Ranger in the picture. The face remained hidden. The name remained missing. Yet the connection between them was obvious. "Who were you waiting for?" Ethan whispered. Ranger's ears twitched. The movement lasted less than a second. Ethan felt a chill run through him. Later that morning, he drove to a nearby Veterans Archive office located several miles from the training center. The building occupied an old brick structure surrounded by oak trees. Inside, the scent of paper and dust filled the air. Retired records lined shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. An elderly archivist named Walter greeted him warmly. "Operation Silent Harbor?" Walter repeated after hearing the name. "That goes back a while." Ethan nodded. "Can you help me?" Walter disappeared into a storage room and returned carrying several binders. For nearly 2 hours, Ethan searched through documents. Mission summaries, deployment reports, unit rosters. Most information remained heavily restricted or incomplete. Then he found it. A brief reference buried inside an old logistics file. Operation Silent Harbor. Naval Special Warfare Support Unit. Experimental K-9 Integration Program. Ethan's pulse quickened. Several names appeared beneath the heading. Most meant nothing to him. One stood out. Chief Petty Officer Lucas Mercer. Ethan read the name twice. Something about it felt important. Several pages later, he found another note. K-9 assignment. Ranger. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Finally, a name. A connection. A real person. Yet the next page had been removed entirely. Walter noticed his frustration. Missing again? Ethan nodded. The archivist sighed. Happens more often than people realize. Ethan thanked him and left with copies of the available records. By the time he returned to the facility, afternoon rain had begun falling once more. Water streaked across the kennel windows. Ranger sat where he always sat, waiting. Ethan entered the observation corridor carrying the folder. The moment he spoke the name aloud, everything changed. Lucas Mercer. Ranger froze. Completely. The reaction lasted barely 2 seconds. Yet it was unmistakable. The German Shepherd's ears rose sharply. His eyes locked onto Ethan. Hope flashed across his face so suddenly it almost hurt to witness. Then it vanished. The dog turned back toward the entrance again. Ethan's heart pounded. You know that name. Ranger remained motionless. But the answer had already been given. Across the room, Sergeant Miles had witnessed the entire exchange. "What was that?" he asked quietly. Ethan never looked away from the dog. The first real clue. Evening arrived early beneath the storm clouds. Rain hammered the roof harder than before. Shadows filled the corners of the facility. Most employees headed home. Ethan stayed. He sat outside the enclosure while reviewing every document again. Lucas Mercer. Operation Silent Harbor. Missing pages. Missing photographs. Missing explanations. The puzzle pieces were beginning to align. Then something unexpected happened. A loud burst of static crackled from a radio left on a nearby desk. The sound echoed through the corridor. Ranger reacted instantly. He jumped to his feet and stared toward the source. Not with fear. Not with aggression. Recognition. Ethan watched carefully. The static faded. Ranger remained standing. For several seconds, he seemed trapped between two worlds. The present and some distant memory only he could see. Then slowly he lowered his head. Ethan understood more than ever before that this was not a training problem. It was not disobedience. It was grief tied to a memory powerful enough to survive years of separation. As darkness settled outside and rain continued drumming against the metal roof, Ethan looked at the German shepherd standing alone beneath the fluorescent lights. Somewhere hidden within forgotten records and buried military history was the story of Lucas Mercer. And Ethan had a growing feeling that when he finally uncovered the truth, it would explain why Ranger had spent years staring at a doorway, still waiting for a man who was never coming back. The storm finally passed during the night, leaving behind a cold, clear morning washed in silver sunlight. For the first time all week, rays of light slipped through the kennel windows and painted long rectangles across the concrete floor. Ranger sat within one of those bright patches, his dark coat glowing softly beneath the morning sun. Ethan Walker noticed the change immediately. The German shepherd looked different in natural light. Older somehow. Not physically older, but weary in a way that only came from years of carrying something unresolved. Ethan arrived carrying a fresh folder tucked beneath his arm. Inside were new records he had spent hours gathering from retired personnel databases and archived military contacts. He sat in his usual chair outside the enclosure and watched Ranger for several minutes before speaking. "I found more pieces of your story." Ranger lifted his head slightly. Ethan smiled. "I am starting to think you knew someone extraordinary." The dog stared quietly. Somewhere down the corridor, a radio played soft country music. Staff members moved between buildings enjoying the first dry day in nearly a week. The facility felt lighter. Yet the mystery surrounding Ranger seemed heavier than ever. Around mid-morning, Ethan received a phone call from a retired military dog trainer named Frank Donovan. Frank had worked with Special Operations K-9 programs years earlier. After hearing Ranger's name, he agreed to meet. By noon, the elderly trainer arrived carrying a weathered canvas bag and enough memories to fill a library. His gray beard moved slightly in the autumn wind as he stepped from his truck. "You are the medic asking questions," Frank said. Ethan nodded. "And you are the man who might have answers." Frank chuckled softly. "Maybe a few." They sat together in a small conference room overlooking the kennel. Ethan placed the photograph on the table. The moment Frank saw it, his expression changed. "I know this dog," he said quietly. Ethan leaned forward. "And the man beside him?" Frank stared at the image for several moments. Lucas Mercer. Hearing the name spoken aloud felt different this time. More real. More human. Frank nodded slowly. "One of the finest handlers I ever worked with." Ethan listened carefully. Outside the window, Ranger remained visible in the distance. "What happened?" Ethan asked. Frank sighed. "Officially, the operation ended. Records were sealed. Personnel reassigned. And unofficially," Frank looked toward the dog. "A lot of people got hurt emotionally. Especially him." He pointed toward Ranger. Silence settled between them. Frank reached into his canvas bag and removed a worn notebook. The pages looked decades old. Inside were handwritten notes from training programs long discontinued. Ethan flipped carefully through the pages. Most contained ordinary commands and behavioral observations. Then he stopped. One section had been highlighted in faded yellow marker. Experimental Bond Recall Protocol. Ethan frowned. "What is this?" Frank leaned back. "A communication system they tested years ago with certain special operations teams." Ethan continued reading. Several verbal cues appeared beneath the heading. Short phrases. Unique commands. None resembled standard K-9 training language. Why have I never heard of these? Frank smiled sadly. Because the program disappeared. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Rangers suddenly reacted inside the enclosure. Through the conference room window, both men saw the dog rise from the floor and face their direction. Interesting timing, Frank muttered. Ethan looked back down at the notebook. One phrase near the bottom had been circled multiple times. Unlike the others, it carried a handwritten note beside it. Emergency trust recall. Handler bond reinforcement. Ethan stared at the words. Something deep inside told him this mattered. Did Lucas use these commands? Frank nodded. Every day. Ethan looked toward Ranger again. The German shepherd remained standing. Watching. Waiting. Almost as though he knew they were discussing something important. Do you remember the phrase? Ethan asked quietly. Frank hesitated. For a moment, he seemed reluctant to answer. I remember all of them. Ethan's heart began beating faster. Years of confusion. Years of failed handlers. Years of loneliness trapped inside a kennel. What if the answer had been hidden inside forgotten training methods all along? Frank tapped one finger gently against the notebook. Be careful. Why? Because some memories stay asleep for a reason. Ethan understood the warning. Yet he also understood something else. Ranger had spent years searching for a doorway that never opened, waiting for a person who never returned. If a forgotten command connected to that memory, it might explain everything. Late that afternoon, after Frank departed, Ethan returned to his chair beside the enclosure. The notebook rested in his lap. Ranger watched him with unusual focus. Sunlight faded slowly beyond the windows. Shadows stretched across the floor. Ethan studied the circled phrase one final time. A command buried inside a discontinued program. A command Lucas Mercer had reportedly used every day. A command nobody at the facility even remembered existed. Ethan closed the notebook and looked directly into Ranger's eyes. For the first time since arriving, he felt certain he stood at the edge of the truth. Tomorrow he would test the forgotten words. Tomorrow he would discover whether the answer to Ranger's pain had been hiding inside a single command all along. The next day arrived beneath a sky the color of steel. Thick clouds drifted slowly above the facility, turning the morning lights soft and muted. Ethan Walker barely noticed. His thoughts had remained fixed on the same thing all night. The notebook rested on the passenger seat during the drive. The circled phrase seemed to carry more weight with every passing hour. By the time he stepped through the kennel doors, he had already read it dozens of times. The familiar sounds greeted him immediately. Ventilation fans humming overhead. Distant footsteps echoing through corridors. The scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. Yet something felt different. Ranger was already standing near the front of the enclosure. Not staring toward the entrance this time. Staring toward Ethan. For several long seconds neither moved. The German shepherd's amber eyes remained fixed on him. Calm. Focused. Expectant. Ethan felt an unfamiliar tension settle in his chest. Not fear. Responsibility. If the forgotten command truly mattered, what happened next could change everything. He carried his folding chair to the usual spot beside the enclosure and sat down. Several staff members had quietly gathered farther down the corridor. Word had spread. Nobody knew exactly what Ethan planned to do, but they all sensed something important was about to happen. Sergeant Miles stood near the observation window. Even Frank Donovan had returned, leaning against the wall with folded arms and a thoughtful expression. Nobody spoke loudly. The atmosphere felt almost sacred. Ethan opened the notebook. His eyes drifted across the faded handwriting one final time. Emergency trust recall. Handler bond reinforcement. The phrase itself was surprisingly simple. Just a few words. Yet somewhere inside Ranger's past, those words carried meaning powerful enough to survive years of silence. Ethan closed the notebook. Ranger remained completely still. The kennel seemed quieter than usual. Even the ventilation system felt distant. Ethan slowly stood and moved one step closer to the enclosure. Not enough to threaten, just enough to be heard clearly. Ranger, he said softly. The dog lifted his ears. Ethan swallowed. Every person watching held their breath. Then he spoke the forgotten command. The words left his mouth barely above a whisper. Simple, gentle, familiar. For an instant nothing happened. The silence stretched across the corridor. Seconds passed. Ethan wondered if he had been wrong. Then Ranger froze. Completely. The German shepherd stopped moving as though time itself had paused. His ears rose sharply. His eyes widened. Every muscle became still. The transformation was immediate and impossible to miss. Ethan felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Ranger was listening to something no one else could hear. Not a sound. A memory. The dog's gaze shifted slowly past Ethan. Past the corridor. Past the walls of the facility. Looking somewhere far beyond the present. Frank Donovan lowered his head. "My God," he whispered. Ranger took one hesitant step forward. Then another. His breathing changed. Ethan remained perfectly still. He understood that this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to the dog. A lifetime seemed to pass inside a few seconds. Then something remarkable happened. For the first time since arriving at the facility, Ranger lowered his head. Not in defeat. Not in fear. In recognition. Ethan felt emotion tightening his throat. The German Shepherd continued moving toward the front of the enclosure. Slowly, carefully, as though approaching a ghost. Tears unexpectedly gathered in Sergeant Miles's eyes. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. Every person present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Ranger stopped only a few feet from the gate. His eyes never left Ethan. Yet Ethan knew the dog was seeing someone else. Someone from long ago. Someone connected to the missing files, the faded photograph, and the doorway he had watched for years. The forgotten command had not taught Ranger anything new. It had awakened something he already carried inside him. A bond. A memory. A promise. Ethan crouched carefully beside the enclosure. "It is okay," he said quietly. Ranger's ears twitched. The dog's tail moved once. Just once. Yet the gesture felt larger than any dramatic breakthrough. Frank wiped a hand across his face and looked away. Outside, sunlight briefly broke through the clouds, casting warm light through the kennel windows. Golden reflections stretched across the concrete floor. The corridor felt brighter, warmer, hopeful. Ranger remained near the gate long after the command had been spoken. He no longer stared toward the distant entrance. For the first time in years, his attention rested somewhere else. Somewhere closer. Ethan understood then that they had crossed an invisible line. The mystery was not over. The truth about Lucas Mercer still waited in the shadows. But the wall surrounding Ranger's heart had finally begun to crack. And as the afternoon light slowly filled the kennel, Ethan realized that tomorrow would bring something even more important than answers. Tomorrow might bring understanding. The following morning felt different from every morning that had come before. No storms rattled the roof. No heavy clouds darkened the windows. Pale sunlight spilled through the glass and stretched across the kennel floor like a quiet promise. Ethan Walker noticed the change the moment he entered the building. Ranger was no longer sitting in the far corner watching the entrance. Instead, the German Shepherd stood near the front of the enclosure, waiting, not for the door at the end of the corridor. For Ethan, the realization stopped him for a moment. It was a small change to anyone else. To Ethan, it felt enormous. He approached slowly and took his usual seat beside the gate. Ranger remained standing. His eyes followed every movement. Calm, focused, present. The distance that had existed between them for years seemed smaller now. Not gone, but smaller. Staff members passing through the corridor noticed it too. Conversations became whispers. Curious glances lingered longer than usual. Everyone had witnessed the reaction to the forgotten command the previous day. Nobody could explain it. Yet nobody could deny it either. Something inside Ranger had awakened. Something long buried beneath years of waiting. Ethan opened his notebook, but found himself unable to write. Instead, he simply watched the dog. Several minutes passed in comfortable silence. Then Ranger did something no report had ever mentioned. The German Shepherd slowly walked closer to the gate. One careful step, then another. Ethan remained still. Ranger stopped only a few feet away and lowered his nose toward the concrete floor. His breathing remained calm. His posture carried no tension, no uncertainty. For the first time since arriving at the facility, Ethan saw curiosity replacing sorrow. Across the corridor, Sergeant Miles stood watching from a distance. "I have never seen him do that," he said quietly. Ethan smiled without looking away from Ranger. Maybe we are finally meeting the real dog. The hours passed peacefully. Throughout the morning, Ranger remained near the front of the enclosure. Sometimes he sat, sometimes he stood. Yet he rarely returned to the corner that had once become his entire world. The change seemed subtle from the outside, but Ethan understood its significance. The dog was no longer trapped entirely inside old memories. Part of him had begun returning to the present. Shortly after lunch, Frank Donovan arrived carrying another small folder. The retired trainer looked tired but determined. "I found something," he said. Ethan followed him into the conference room overlooking the kennel. Inside the folder rested several photographs rescued from old storage archives. Most showed training exercises from years ago. Then Ethan found one image that immediately captured his attention. Lucas Mercer sat beside Ranger beneath a desert sunset. Neither looked toward the camera. The SEAL's hand rested gently on the dog's shoulder. Ranger leaned slightly against him. There was nothing dramatic about the photograph. No medals. No action. No ceremony. Just trust. Pure and unmistakable trust. Ethan stared at the image for a long time. "They were family," he said quietly. Frank nodded. Everyone knew it. Ethan turned the photograph over. A handwritten note covered the back. The ink had faded, but several words remained visible. "Until the mission ends." The phrase settled heavily inside the room. Ethan looked through the observation window toward Ranger. The German shepherd sat peacefully near the gate. Waiting no longer seemed like the right word. Hoping felt closer. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned to the enclosure carrying the photograph. He crouched beside the gate and carefully held the image where Ranger could see it. The dog's reaction was immediate. His ears lifted. His eyes locked onto the photograph. Then something remarkable happened. Ranger moved closer. Closer than he had ever approached before. Ethan could hear the dog's breathing. Could see tiny reflections of light dancing within his eyes. Ranger stared at the image of Lucas Mercer. Seconds passed. Then the German shepherd gently lowered his head. Ethan felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside his chest. The gesture carried no fear. No confusion. It felt almost like recognition. Like remembrance. Like missing someone. Neither man nor dog moved. Outside the windows, afternoon sunlight bathed the facility in gold. Dust particles drifted lazily through beams of light. Somewhere down the corridor, a radio played soft music. The ordinary sounds of life continued around them. Yet inside that moment, time seemed to slow. Ethan finally understood what nobody else had seen. Ranger had never been fighting handlers. He had been searching for someone. Every doorway, every footstep, every passing vehicle, every shadow crossing the entrance. For years he had been hoping the person he trusted most would somehow return. The forgotten command had not created trust. It had reopened a door to memory. And now, for the first time in a very long time, those memories were beginning to lead Ranger somewhere new. As the sun slowly descended beyond the windows and warm evening light filled the kennel, the German shepherd remained near the gate beside Ethan. Not watching the entrance. Not waiting for the impossible. Simply sitting beside the one person willing to understand why he had waited in the first place. The truth arrived quietly on a cool autumn morning. No dramatic announcement. No sudden discovery hidden inside a forgotten vault. Just a phone call. Ethan Walker stood near the kennel window holding a cup of coffee when his phone vibrated. The screen displayed Frank Donovan's name. Ethan answered immediately. Frank's voice sounded softer than usual. "I found the final report." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Outside the enclosure, Ranger rested near the gate, watching him with calm eyes. "Is it complete?" Ethan asked. "Almost. Enough to understand what happened." Less than an hour later, Frank arrived carrying a thin folder. The retired trainer looked older than he had the week before, as if the memories inside those pages carried weight. Together, they entered the conference room overlooking the kennel. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating dust floating through the air. Ranger remained visible below, lying quietly on the floor. Frank opened the folder and carefully removed several documents. Lucas Mercer completed Operation Silent Harbor successfully, he began. Ethan listened without interruption. The mission ended. The team returned. But immediately afterward, personnel were reassigned. Records were sealed. Several members transferred to different units. Ethan frowned. What about Ranger? Frank sighed. That is where things became complicated. He slid a page across the table. Ethan read slowly. Administrative delays. Medical evaluations. Temporary holding assignments. Weeks turning into months. What should have been a brief separation became something far longer. Lucas kept requesting reunification, Frank said. Every request. Ethan looked up, and Frank stared toward the kennel below. Before the process was completed, Lucas passed away from an illness that developed unexpectedly after his final deployment. Silence filled the room. Ethan lowered his eyes to the papers. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Outside the conference room window, Ranger remained still beneath the sunlight. Waiting. Ethan suddenly understood everything. The doorway, the vehicles, the years of watching, the endless hope. Ranger had never been abandoned intentionally. He had simply never received an explanation. One day his handler disappeared. The next day became another day. Then another. Then another. Weeks became months. Months became years. Yet no one had ever helped him understand why the man he trusted most never returned. Frank's voice grew quieter. He spent years expecting Lucas to come back. Ethan nodded slowly. Because nobody ever told him the mission was over. Tears gathered in the corners of Frank's eyes. Exactly. Later that afternoon, Ethan carried the photograph of Lucas Mercer back to the enclosure. The facility felt unusually peaceful. Sunlight filled the corridor. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby office. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Ethan crouched beside the gate and placed the photograph gently against the fencing where Ranger could see it. The German shepherd approached immediately. His movements were calm now. No hesitation. No confusion. He sat directly in front of the image and studied it carefully. Ethan remained silent. The moment did not require words. Ranger looked at Lucas, then looked at Ethan, then back at the photograph again. The sequence repeated several times. Ethan felt his throat tighten. It was as if the dog was trying to connect two worlds. The world he had lost and the world standing before him now. After several minutes, Ranger lowered himself onto the floor beside the photograph. Not guarding it. Resting beside it. Peacefully. Ethan watched in silence. For the first time, the gesture did not feel like waiting. It felt like remembering. Across the corridor, Sergeant Miles paused and smiled softly. He looks different. Ethan nodded. He understands something now. The sun continued moving across the sky. Warm light painted golden reflections along the concrete floor. Ranger eventually closed his eyes for a brief nap beside the photograph. A simple thing. An ordinary thing. Yet everyone who knew his story understood its meaning. For years he had watched every doorway, every shadow, every arriving vehicle. Now, for the first time, he slept without facing the entrance. As evening approached, Ethan sat beside the enclosure longer than usual. Ranger remained close to him. The old photograph rested nearby. The mystery that had haunted the facility for years no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a story unfinished. A loyal dog had spent years honoring a bond he never forgot. And now, at last, someone had finally uncovered the truth hidden beneath the silence. But Ethan sensed something else as well. Understanding the past was only part of the journey. Ahead of them waited an even more important question. If Ranger finally knew why Lucas never returned, could he learn to stop waiting and begin living again? Winter arrived quietly a few weeks later. The trees surrounding the training facilities stood bare against pale skies, and thin layers of frost appeared on the grass each morning before the sun melted them away. Much had changed during those weeks. Ranger no longer spent his days staring toward the entrance. The old corner of the enclosure remained empty most of the time. Instead, he stayed near the front gate whenever Ethan Walker visited. Staff members no longer whispered warnings when they passed. They smiled. Some even stopped to greet him. The German shepherd who had once been described as unreachable now moved through each day with a calm confidence nobody thought possible. Yet the greatest change had happened somewhere deeper. The waiting was gone. One cold afternoon, Ethan arrived carrying a small wooden frame. He entered the conference room overlooking the kennel and placed it carefully on the shelf beside the window. Inside the frame sat the photograph of Lucas Mercer and Ranger beneath the desert sunset. The image remained simple. Honest, timeless, a reminder of a bond that had never truly disappeared. Ranger noticed it immediately. He walked to the front of the enclosure and looked toward the photograph. For several seconds he remained still. Then he lowered his head slightly before returning his attention to Ethan. The gesture felt peaceful, not sad, not longing, just respectful, like a soldier honoring an old friend. That evening Ethan received a call from the review board. The final decision regarding Ranger's future had been made. He listened quietly as the details were explained. When the call ended, a slow smile appeared on his face. The next morning, he arrived carrying a new leash. Not because Ranger needed one, because they were going somewhere together. Sergeant Miles met him near the entrance. "You got the approval?" Ethan nodded. "Officially." Miles looked toward the kennel and laughed softly. "I never thought I would see this day." Neither had Ethan. They opened the enclosure gate. Ranger stood calmly inside. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Ethan stepped forward and clipped the leash gently onto the dog's collar. Ranger remained relaxed. The moment felt surprisingly ordinary. After everything they had uncovered, after years of mystery and silence, the beginning of a new chapter arrived not through drama, but through simplicity. One man, one dog, one open gate. They walked out together beneath a bright winter sky. The drive home took less than an hour. Ranger sat quietly in the back seat, watching the landscape pass through the windows. Small towns, open fields, bare trees reaching toward the horizon. Ethan occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror. Each time he did, he found the German shepherd looking back at him, not searching for someone else, looking at him. The house sat near the edge of a wooded area outside town. Nothing extravagant, just a modest home with a porch, a stone pathway, and a backyard large enough for a dog to run freely. Ethan opened the front door and stepped aside. Ranger paused on the threshold. Sunlight filtered through the windows. The scent of wood and coffee lingered in the air. A fire crackled softly inside the living room fireplace. For a moment, the German shepherd simply looked around. Then he walked inside, slowly, carefully, exploring each room, learning every corner, discovering a place that belonged to him. As evening settled beyond the windows, Ethan hung the framed photograph of Lucas Mercer above a bookshelf near the fireplace. Beside it, he placed a small dog tag mounted within a shadow box. A memory preserved, a story honored. Ranger approached and sat quietly beneath the display. The firelight reflected softly across his dark coat. Ethan lowered himself into a nearby chair. Neither moved for several minutes. The room felt warm, peaceful, whole. Outside, snow began falling gently across the yard. Tiny white flakes drifted through the darkness. Inside, the only sounds were the crackling fire and the steady rhythm of a dog finally at rest. Eventually, Ranger stood and crossed the room. He stopped beside Ethan's chair. Then, with complete trust, he lowered himself onto the rug and rested his head against Ethan's boot. Ethan smiled and reached down to place a hand gently on the German shepherd's shoulder. No commands, no expectations, no unfinished missions, just companionship. The fire continued burning softly as night deepened beyond the windows. The photograph of Lucas Mercer watched over the room from above the bookshelf. A chapter had ended. Another had begun. For years, Ranger had waited for a door to open. For years, he had searched every shadow and every footstep, hoping to see a familiar face return. Now the waiting was over. The mission had finally ended. And in the quiet glow of a winter evening, beside a warm fire and a new friend, a loyal dog closed his eyes and went to sleep, knowing he was home.